Recently, I made a video titled 10 movies that all photographers should watch, and on the comments and also quite timely on my social media, I got a lot of messages of you guys asking me to watch Ripley because it was really so good. And actually, I had watched the Ripley already, and I realized with your comments and messages that I should actually make a video about this show and why photographers and creators, should we put it this way, filmmakers, writers, whatever you are, should watch this show, because there's a lot of things that we can take from it. And I'm only gonna scratch the surface here with this video, but I highly recommend you to watch if you're interested in learning and exploring the things that I'm gonna be talking about this video a little bit further. So I want you now to relax, grab a drink, make yourself comfortable, and let's find out why should we watch Ripley in 2024. Now let's answer a few basic questions. What is Ripley and what's it about? Well, Ripley is a 2024 limited series currently streaming on Netflix based on Patricia Highsmith's 1955 crime novel The Talented Mr. Ripley, which is actually part of a series of crime novels collectively titled The Ripleyad. They revolve around a fictional character named Tom Ripley, who for a time was struggling to make a living in New York City, resorting to some petty crime and small-scale scams. However, Ripley's circumstances changed once he is hired by a shipping magnate named Herbert Greenleaf, who wants Ripley to persuade his son Dickie, who is currently living in his artistic, quote, self-exilement in Italy, to return home and join the family business. However, Tom's acquaintance with Dickie becomes, quote, the first step into a complex life of deceit, fraud, and murder. Now, the million-dollar question is, why should we watch this show? So I actually am going to divide the video right here. We're going to be talking about visuals first, aesthetics, influences, lighting, contrast, and whatnot. And then we're going to be talking about structural points, and that could be the rhythm, could be also a very important thing, which is how much information do we give to an audience, and meaning and intention and all of those things that I feel like are super important. So I think right now is very timely to probably dim the saturation here, and I think this is probably okay right now because we're going to talk about black and white. All 8 episodes are entirely shot in black and white, and its cinematography style is actually quite playful. And I use the word playful because it's a style that really plays with a lot of elements such as deep contrasts, details, proportions, angles. And what really is impressive, at least to me, is how much quality is in this show. At least in my own experience, you're never gonna cease to be amazed or at least be intrigued to see what the filmmakers are gonna pull on next. And that's also why I say it's a surprising style, because at every corner of every location, the placement of the actors, the way the scene is lit, is truly a masterclass and truly an interesting watch. And that is why I would also call this cinematography style quite bold. Bold in a sense that for the general Netflix audience, this show might appear quite crafted, more sophisticated if you will, and I love that Netflix is embracing different and highly stylized content like this. Now, I also love reading the words of Steven Zaillian, the writer and creator of the show, that both he and cinematographer Robert Elswith, quote, knew from the beginning that we wanted to have this high contrast film noir style. We didn't want to do anything that was familiar to us. I personally didn't want to make a pretty travelogue, which sets the tone for much of what we're about to discuss and see. Elswith talks in interviews about employing, quote, film noir lighting, which is generally made of a key light that is used to illuminate the subject or a given spot in a space, while adjacent lights are placed intentionally and diffused to create specific shadows or only showcase certain important details on screen. Although I would also argue that this isn't just film noir lighting. In fact, when I was watching the show, certain scenes reminded me almost of Rembrandt lighting, with certain close-ups to the actors, and the early German expressionist movies of the 1910s and 1920s, so I was actually surprised to see my suspicions confirmed when the cinematographer of the show called this shot right here the show's own Nosferatu shot. Anyways, when we look at some of the night scenes as well, they're so dark and bold, visually speaking. It almost reminds me as well of the photography of Eugene Smith. And he very famously said, when called out by critics for his very dark photography, quote, "You can actually see what matters." And that is true for Ripley here. The darkness is intentional to the darkness of the plot, to the crimes being committed, to the driving madness at the core of the main character. And still, on this topic of film noir lighting, we cannot forget one important reference that is made during this show, and that is the painting of Michelangelo Caravaggio. And personally, I couldn't be more pleased when this reference was made, and the scene in which it happens is actually very interesting and very important. I don't want to give any spoilers or anything like that, but I feel like the scene where inspired by Caravaggio, Tom actually adjusts the lighting, really is a massive shout out at how important light is, and how also the different roles that light can have. It can be expressive, it can be dramatic, it can be also intriguing, ambiguous. So all these things, deceiving as well. I feel like that was the role of light as well in this particular scene. So I feel like this is super important. And also, if you want to probably dive deeper into Caravaggio's work, it really is worth of your time. He has a particular technique of chiaroscuro. I actually feel like maybe we should do a video about it here on the channel. I know a lot about Caravaggio because I've studied, I've made work, like writings on him before for college and for other things. And I'm extremely familiar with his work and how he worked. He was a very troubled individual, but a genius at the same time. So if you want to see a video about that, let me know down below. And yeah, I think that we're gonna close on this note and dive into other areas of Ripley that I think it can be so important to study. Now, angles are very important, as we all know, and I recognize in Ripley, particularly in some scenes, the use of very high or low angles, which I would entirely agree here to be a very noir influence. My opinion, though, is that these are essential in promoting the complexity of Ripley's situation and the plot he concocted as time goes by. In fact, because we're so close to Tom Ripley, at least for the first 6.5 episodes, and his point of view for most of what's happening there, it's almost like we're following him into this labyrinth of lies and deceit that is metaphorical, but at the same time visual and palpable. And this can also be inferred through the visual symmetry of the various existing shots, showing us Tom and the other characters through shelves and other barriers put between camera and characters. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of this story, and this is beyond the scope of the show for me, this is about the story itself, the book and etc., is the idea of touching identity. And in this case, the idea of double identity or double body double, if you will, double personality. I think we can tie this with the German Doppelganger, and which I think in German stands for double. And so a double of the self, a double a double of something, right? And so here, of course, we have the idea of Ripley and Dickie being the doubles. And I think this is super important to talk about because I wanted to tell you at least how I perceive that the filmmakers communicated this through visual language. Now, just a little disclaimer, if you haven't watched the show up until now, then skip the next section of the video because in order to make my point, I'm gonna need to give you a little bit of a spoiler. So, in essence, during the show, we see Tom Ripley assuming the identity of Richard Greenleaf. We can take this for face value and understand that this was a kind of life Tom had ambitions to live, but could only do it through Dickie's identity and access to money. But the visual language of the series also suggests this idea of Tom being Dickie's double or doppelganger, rather than just a separate entity through the many shots that display this idea of duality, whether that is through the framing of two different figures, the idea of using multiples on screen, and the idea as well of using mirrors and reflections. I mean, in the first episode, this is given a lot through the idea of reflections in windows in particular. So maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I just feel like watching this series really helps understanding how we can convey our intentions or aspects that we want to highlight in a certain project or photo. One of the biggest criticisms that I've seen the show receiving online is particularly tied with rhythm, and the criticism is that the show can be quite slow-moving. Now, I for one feel as though slower paced suits the narrative and the visual style, but I can also understand that many people might not appreciate this. But then, my argument is, if the rhythm was much faster, the impact and the playfulness of the visuals would probably be much smaller, or we probably would really not appreciate it as much because it would just be so fast. And I say this conscious of two things this show is extremely good at highlighting. First, we have to talk about meaning and intention and how detrimental these are to know exactly what the story is about and how are we going to tell said story, how these two promote a clarity over the materials we're dealing with. And then second, how important it is to be measured with how much information we communicate or divulge in a single piece or photo or scene or page, if you will, whatever medium you're working with. I believe there's a fine line that separates the creator from the viewer, and that is not only made by the object or images that we create, if you will, but how much information they contain in order to shape the viewer's interpretation of a scene or image. When we look at Ripley, though, we can quickly recognize a dominant ambiguity that begins at the very start. This is suggested by the scale of certain shots, the proportion of certain spaces, the proximity of the characters to the camera, and thus to us, the viewers. So I hope this, light discussion has been helpful to you in any way, shape, or form. But to close this video off, I actually want to give you a bonus, quote unquote, or a tip or a suggestion, if you will. Since this video was made, as of course, out of your guys' suggestions as well. There's been several adaptations of The Talented Mr. Ripley, the book. And I wanted to I think the most famous one has been the one with John Malkovich and Matt Damon. And John Malkovich actually makes an appearance in Ripley, kind of like, short, brief appearances here and there. But one of my favorite adaptations of this tale has actually been with Alain Delon playing Tom Ripley, and that was in the 1960 version of this story that was actually titled Purple Noon, masterfully directed by René Clément. So if you want to watch it, I definitely can leave links to it down below. I think it is part of the Criterion collection, so you might be able to find at the Criterion channel if you're over in the US and Canada. But yeah, I guess that it's all for today. I won't take any more of your time, which by the way, I'm very grateful for taking your time to watch this video. I really appreciate it. More coming very soon. So, take care, stay safe, keep shooting, keep creating, keep learning photography, and I'm out.